Hey there friends, and welcome to this technique tutorial where I'm going to show you how you can blend two different colours or two and more colours in your watercolour when you're using watercolour with your embroidery. So as you can see, I've got a hoop here where I have already blended some colours together just to kind of show you what we're looking for here. So this one on the left is perhaps less blended or not blended as well compared to the one on the right, which the blend is much more smoother and it has a stronger gradient. Now I just want to caveat that by saying that this one isn't wrong and this one right. It's not that. It's more a case of a smoother blend and kind of the colours doing what you want them to do rather than having their own mind. So this one I intended for it to be half blue and half green. It might help if I actually held this a bit closer for you to see. So you can kind of see that this one has a bit more of a kind of solid line. This one, it does blend much more easily from blue into the green. And you can't necessarily see a strict point where one colour stopped and another one began. So again, this doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that if you're doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. It just means that there are ways where you can blend colours a bit more seamlessly so that they do kind of have this gradient, if that is what you are going for. The main thing I want to share with you here is that actually how colours blend comes down a lot to the preparation of the paint rather than the way that you paint. And that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but the way to explain it is that fabric is very, very absorbent, and if you put too much water, or if the paint that you use is kind of liquidated down too much, then it's going to bleed and it's going to go anywhere it wants to go. On the other hand, if you go straight from the colour directly onto the fabric and use very little water, then you're going to really struggle to blend the colours together because they're going to sit completely separately and they're not going to blend very smoothly. So it is a bit of like a Goldilocks almost, of like the right consistency of the paint. It just makes it so much easier to blend. So what I'm going to do is show you how I would blend two colours so that we get this result rather than this result. So if you've watched the previous video on watercolour, you'll know that I like to use this pen. Now you probably can't see, but it is filled with water. And then when you squeeze it here, water comes directly out of the brush itself, which means you don't need to have like a separate pot as such to rinse it off. I quite often do, just so that I can rinse as much as the paint off as possible when I need a clean brush. But you know, realistically you don't really need it. So as you can see, I'm just going to squeeze and water comes out of the brush. And I find this the easiest way to do it, just because then you can really control the amount of water that you're using. You can squeeze when you need a bit more and so on. I will put a link below to a similar palette to this one. I don't believe this one exists anymore, sadly, but there is a close alternative that I will link in the description for you. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to blend two colours. Now I'm not going to draw a box, I'm just going to go a bit more freeform. And I'm going to pick two colours that don't perhaps blend quite so well. So I might go in with, let's see, the blue and green was a good example actually. So a bad thing to do now would be straight from this purple colour that I'm using at the top, directly here, because that's going to be too much paint and not enough water, and you're going to lose control of where that paint ends up going. So I'm just going to add it to the water that I've already squeezed out. Maybe squeeze a little bit more out just to dilute it even further. Again, we don't want to, squeeze loads and loads and loads of water out here, because that's what's going to make the paint so loose and so watery that you're then going to just have bleeding all over the fabric. The paint's going to go where you don't want it to go, which is never good for any kind of watercolour on your fabric, but it's also not that great for blending. So I'm quite happy with that colour there. So I'm just going to go ahead and do some blobs on here. I'm not being too specific about where I paint for this particular example. I'm just showing you how I would typically blend two colours. So that's actually not that liquidy, even though it's very watery here. It's not appearing that liquidy on the fabric, and you can see that because as I'm kind of dragging the brush like this, it's not really resulting in much water or anything coming the other way. So I'm just going to squeeze a bit more water out over here. And you can see now that's already made it much looser, much easier to kind of drag it and blend it. So the next colour I'm going to choose is actually going to be orange. So I'm just going to squeeze some of the purple out of the brush there. And I'm going to go in with orange here. Squeeze a bit more water into that one. And the next tip for you is if you're blending two colours, I now wouldn't immediately drop the orange right here, because what's going to happen is that orange is going to encroach. Because this piece of the fabric is wet, it's just going to completely take over that purple that we've done, which is what happened up here. That green completely soaked into the blue. So rather, I'm going to go in with the orange at the other end. And I'm going to do exactly what I did here for the purple. Again, it's not very watery, so I'm going to add a bit more water to that, just to help with the blend. And I'm going to get those two pretty close together, like so. So now you can see we've got two colours next to each other, and obviously this looks incredibly blocky at the moment. You're going to think, how on earth are they going to blend well together? And that's because we're kind of inviting that blend to happen without forcing it. And like I said, if I were to drop in orange here now, in the typical way that watercolour works, that would just kind of disperse straight away, and it would completely overtake the purple colour. So we do have to kind of go about it a little bit more delicately, and I do that just by then using water at this point. So as you know, I don't get the fabric completely wet before I watercolour the background for embroidery, and that's because the more water you add to the fabric, the more likely that watercolour is to bleed and go outside of the lines that you want to stitch in. You have so much more control when you go from wet brush to dry fabric. So in order to get these two colours to blend, I now kind of almost do the opposite, and I go in with a wet brush and I kind of just add some water into the middle section. So again, I'm going to get rid of as much of the orange off of that brush as I can. It doesn't matter if you've still got a bit in there, it just means that I'm going to start on the orange side. And actually what I'm going to do is just grab pretty much just water at this point, and I'm just going to dab in the middle. And you'll notice at this point that I'm not being really rough and dragging the paintbrush through all of it, and I'm not kind of doing big movements. I'm kind of dabbing to help to blend these colours. Now I'll admit I chose two difficult colours to blend here, so this could be a bit of a challenge, but that's the whole point of this, right? To show you that you can blend colours in this way. So now I'm going to go with water like that is slightly purple. So you can see this isn't highly pigmented where my brush is now. This is pretty much just water, but with the slight touch of purple. And I'm now going to go in the other direction. And you can always go in with a slight, if you notice that you're losing a lot of the colour, you can go back in with like the stronger pigment to the one end, just to kind of help bring the colour back into it. Again, you'll see that a lot of my brush movements now are very gentle. You know, I'm not being too harsh, I'm not doing like big elaborate brush strokes. It's more a case of just gentle movements in the direction that we want that blend to happen. So I probably used slightly too much water then, because that, I don't know if you noticed that on the camera, but that allowed the orange to completely disperse into the purple. So I'm just going to kind of try and get as much of the water off of my brush as possible. And I'm just going to go back in and again just make those really gentle movements to mix those two together really nicely. So I'm actually quite happy with how those have blended. You can see how we've gone from purple to orange. It's not super obvious where one colour ends and the next one begins, like it was for this one up here. And you can continue to blend them if you want to, you know, you don't have to stop at that point just because I am. If you want more orange, if you want more purple, you can blend them as you wish. The only thing I would say is that try not to overdo it and to kind of know when done is done. I think the one thing with watercolour, the wetter you get the fabric, the more you reach that kind of point of no return, and then you lose control over where the paint is going to end up. If this fabric is super wet, every tiny drop of paint that you add is just going to disperse and go everywhere. So try to be quite careful with where you're placing the colour, I would say. And the more you kind of overwork it, like especially areas that are already starting to dry, like the edges, especially the edge of the purple, because that's the one we did first, it's already beginning to dry. So if we were to now go in with too much more colour here, it would end up quite blocky and it would struggle to blend in with the purple that it started off with. So I'm going to try and show an example of that. I'm going to grab a bit more purple, because I managed to dilute that quite a bit by adding so much water in over here. So you can see, even just dabbing that on, you can see how much that travelled straight away just by adding in a couple of dabs to the fabric. So again, I'm probably going to need to blend this, so I'm going to squeeze off a lot of that colour. Go in with a damp brush, not super wet, and I'm being so light with the fabric here. I'm not pressing very hard, I'm just very, very gently kind of navigating where I want the bulk of that pigment to go so that it blends a lot easier. It's quite hard to kind of show how gently I am doing that. And to be honest, using very minimal colour as well. You really don't need a lot of watercolour to kind of get a really strong colour. So always use less than you think you need. But again, I'm going against my own advice here because I'm almost not stopping when I feel like I am actually done. So I'm going to call that there, I think, she says. Just going to add a bit more water into the middle just to help. Ended up adding a bit too much water so that I'm actually losing the colour of the purple altogether. So I'm just going back in to add a bit more of that purple in. But there, I'm happy with that, and how that those two colours blend, I'm happy with that. So really, I think stopping is probably the hardest point of this, and knowing when you're done and when to stop is probably the hardest point, because you always see imperfections, I think, in it and want to keep trying to blend it. But you've also got to look at it as a way of, like, using watercolour is so expressive and so creative, and there isn't a right or wrong. As I said at the beginning of this tutorial, this one isn't wrong, and if yours ends up like this, then that's okay. It doesn't make it wrong. It just doesn't blend as smooth, and this is really a skill that comes with practice. And the more that you practice, the more you will be able to blend it a bit easier and kind of notice when you're using too much water or when the paint is too pigmented to blend successfully. But give it a go. I advise not starting with difficult colours to blend like orange and purple. Green and blue are great examples of how you can blend, or maybe red and pink, or orange and red, colours that naturally kind of blend together anyway. These are opposite ends of the colour wheel, so you know, for that reason they're harder to blend on their own right. But I would definitely have a go with blending blue and green, maybe orange and yellow, or orange and red, and see where you get on with that. I'd love to know what you think and whether or not you find this helpful, and I can't wait to see your watercoloured projects in the future. Happy stitching!